In a galaxy-spanning conflict, the mighty Vorth Emperor Sethrak faces an impossible visitor who claims to know his future demise. As the human herald casually discusses the Empire's fall and Sethrak's gruesome fate, reality begins to unravel in ways that challenge everything the Emperor thought he knew about war and time itself. Trapped in a temporal stasis, Sethrak must confront not just his Empire's destruction, but also his own nightmarish destiny as a living trophy for future generations, all while wondering if resistance truly is as futile as this peculiar human suggests. Just a quick reminder before we get started, only 4% of my viewers have subscribed to the channel so far. If you enjoy the content, I'd really appreciate it if you could take a moment to hit that subscribe button and support the channel. Thank you so much. Now start amazing story. Sethrak the Vanquisher, may he live forever, greatest of his line. Conqueror of the Vezran Confederacy and destroyer of the Karn Republic, sat back in his throne room and looked at the reports coming from the front lines of the war with the humans. Of course, anything as quaint as the idea of a front line in a conflict that spanned multiple star systems was laughable, but there was still a look and a shape to things as he stared at the massive three-dimensional display before him that showed him the current disposition of forces. He didn't like the disposition of those forces. He was going to have Korthar beheaded to make it clear to everyone running his glorious empire that there were consequences for failure. He looked down at the printout in his claws. An odd thing, that printout. But there were times when it was good to have everything right in front of you and something that was easy to grasp. He'd always been a fan of the old-fashioned way of doing things, whether that was responding to a peskily tenacious enemy who sent laughable, unconditional surrender requests or dealing with those enemies the old-fashioned way with something simple like a sharp-kneed bit of metal shoved into their vital organs and broadcast to the galaxy as a warning rather than sending them into a disintegrator booth like some of the more enlightened despots of the galaxy preferred. The thing was laughable. The humans were fighting well, certainly, but it wasn't the sort of thing that made him feel any sort of existential dread for the future of his empire. It certainly wasn't the sort of thing that made him want to consider surrendering, for all that he'd heard of their peculiar idea of surrendering, so that the conquered could be subsumed into their own empire, they called a federation of systems. They even did that stupid hand gesture where they split their fingers apart when they saluted someone. He'd thought they were getting ready for an attack the first time, but thankfully the Xeno experts had been there to tell him that was actually a sign they hoped he would live long and prosper. Well, he'd certainly already done that, and he was going to live even longer and prosper by showing these humans what he thought of their talk of unconditional surrender, because there wasn't a chance anything like that was happening. There was a slight whining noise from behind him accompanied by a bright light. He shielded his eyes as he turned to have a look at what was happening, and then he started and brought his blaster up from its secret spot next to his chair, where it was hidden by a small cloaking field that meant it would be a nasty surprise to anyone stupid enough to bother him in his most sacred inner chamber. The blasts hit something, but it was odd. He'd seen some of the shielding technology the humans used, but only with their massive space cruisers and battleships and carriers. Not the sort of thing he'd expect to see on one person standing alone. The human was odd, not at all the sort of warrior he expected to see if they were going to send assassins. He'd heard the exploits of their so-called special forces. The humans had been waging war on one another for so long that they had people who specialized in going behind enemy lines and doing all sorts of terrible things. It turns out there'd been teams of them stationed at important locations all around. The glorious Imperium at the outset of the conflict, and they'd caused great losses before the Imperium could even launch the surprise attack against some of the outlying human colony worlds, like they'd known, or at least suspected. The more time they spent fighting the humans, the more he realized they loved to game out scenarios for fighting everyone, no matter how ridiculous and far-fetched that fight might seem. That had been an embarrassment on a galactic scale, but it was nothing compared to the embarrassment he figured he was looking forward to if one of the humans managed to make it beyond their defenses to kill him personally in the one place in the galaxy where he was supposed to be safe from anything. Generals weren't going to be the only ones who had their heads rolling by the time this was all said and done. The head of his security force was going to have his head on a pike in front of the palace sooner rather than later so he could serve, as an example of what not to do for the future head of security. Terribly sorry about interrupting you in your contemplation of the unconditional surrender request, the human said, clearing its throat and coughing a few times. "But I had a few questions for you, if you don't mind." The human didn't even bother to ask him if it was okay. No, the man, Sethrak was fairly certain it was one of their males, for all that he couldn't see the appendage between his legs, moved across the room and sat down on one of the luxurious couches that was meant only for him, which meant the traps built into the thing immediately triggered. A disintegrator field surrounded the impertinent human, and there was another whine and another bright light. When it cleared, the human still sat there. Sethrak stared, his tongue wrapping around his serrated teeth in a nervous gesture as he realized the human was still there. There was also the faint glow of what looked like some sort of shielding surrounding the human. Sethrak could only stare. How were they able to use shielding technology like that? He'd never heard of them being able to miniaturize something that usually took a ship's antimatter reactor to accomplish. Then again, if ever there was a time when he was going to run up against some of the damnable technology those humans like to invent and demonstrate at the worst possible moment, then it was when they were sending someone specifically to try and kill him. "Oh, I am sorry," the man said, looking down at the thing. "I knew that trap was there, but of course I forgot about it in my haste." He looked around at the couch and then at the rest of the room. Sethrak didn't think it was possible for anyone but him to know where all the traps were, but as the human looked around, he had an unsettling habit of looking exactly where some of those traps were laid. A sense of growing unease was rising in Sethrak. He didn't like this human being here. He suddenly very much wanted to be somewhere else, especially because the human didn't look at all like their special forces. No, they tended to be muscular and lean. Warriors who were almost as big as some of the smaller fighters he sent into the grinder whenever it was time to expand the empire. This human was nothing like that. He had a balding head, for all that he'd tried to move some of his hair over that balding spot so it wouldn't be quite as obvious. The man wore an odd outfit as well. It was a strange jacket of a sickly yellow color that had crisscrossing patterns all along the thing, and there were patches at the elbow. It wore a tie over its undershirt, and a pair of pants that were the same odd colors that made his eyes do a little twirl in their sockets as he stared at them. He almost wondered if it was some kind of camouflage, but even that made no sense under present circumstances. If it was meant to hide the human, then it was doing a terrible job. "Right. My name is Harold. Well, I suppose my last name doesn't matter, but you can call me Harold," the human said. "Harold," Sethrak said, rolling the name around in his mouth. The human names were always a touch difficult to pronounce. Something about the language being developed with an omnivore's mouth, which was a touch difficult for a proper species that had grown out of the cradle of its own world by killing anything and everything they could hunt down to pronounce. "Yes, Harold," he said, making that odd threat gesture. The humans always did that. Was actually a way for them to indicate they were happy. "And I'd just like to convey what an honor it is to meet you like this, Sethrak. I've been a big fan of this conflict since I was a kid." Sethrak moved his tongue around his teeth, again at that one. His eyes didn't quite rotate in their sockets, but they were pretty close. He stared at the human and tried to do some of the math involved, for all that he usually had advisors to do that sort of thing. It was one of the drawbacks of being in his sanctum sanctorum where anyone who interrupted him was on the way to dying very quickly. He was certain the math didn't work out, though. The humans had a lifespan that was similar to his species. They typically lived for about 120 of the rotations of their planet around their home star, which came out to about 90 rotations in Imperial Standard. Still, the war hadn't been going on for more than about 10 Imperial Standard cycles. There was no chance this human could have been a child learning about this conflict. Not even if there were some odd shenanigans where the thing was trapped on a ship traveling close to the speed of light rather than going on one of their warp ships. There were still human generation ships slowing down outside Vorth-owned systems and being promptly destroyed for their trouble. At least the ones that weren't found by the humans, who could now travel faster than light. They didn't have records of all of them, after all. The Empire engaging in a bit of target practice on one of those unknown generation ships had been one of the triggers that started the war. "I'm sorry, but what do you mean you've been a fan of this conflict since you were a child?" he asked. And why would someone be a fan of a conflict? Though it was a notion he was actually quite comfortable with. Venerating the warriors who boldly fought on behalf of the Empire in past conflicts was something human, and Vorth had in common for all that they had different ways of expressing that veneration. Vorth went out into the galaxy to perform great deeds of glory for the Empire. If the reports he got from the fronts were anything to go on, then the humans were slightly more annoying in the way they handled things, like the group of children who managed to get one of their ancient war machines to come to life simply because they'd spent a lot of time reading about the damn thing and making models of it, so they were more than capable of turning around and blasting a battleship from the skies above when the invasion force arrived. The scouts who checked the human worlds assumed those weapons weren't operational. No one thought the humans would have working war machines lying out as decorations scattered across their worlds. His eye twitched at that thought. It would have been almost admirable were it not for the annoying fact that the subsequent explosion of that battleship's reactor had taken out a good chunk of the fleet around them and forced them to call off that particular invasion. "Oh, spoilers," Harold said with an enigmatic smile. "I wouldn't want to give things away before you get there, after all." Sethrak's frown deepened. He didn't know what to make of this human bothering him as he sat here pondering what rude gesture to use when he responded to their demand of unconditional surrender. This definitely wasn't what he'd been expecting. "Now, if you'll excuse me," Harold said, pulling out a tablet and scribbling away at the thing with a stylus. "It would be quite nice if you could tell me a little bit about how you're feeling right now on the eve of so momentous an occasion as the end of the war." Sethrak's eyes rolled around a bit more, but finally he got his irritation under control and turned to the human. "I'm sorry, but what do you mean the end of the war? Are you an envoy come to offer me your surrender?" It would be an odd thing considering he'd just received the ultimatum of an unconditional surrender from the humans. Sure, they were moving in on the core systems, but he figured they would be so drained by that fighting that it wouldn't be worth it for them to pursue the war to the very end. It was something that was hidden in the Empire's secret histories. But there'd been a couple of times when an emperor had bit off more than they could swallow, and they had to make a strategic retreat into the core worlds. The resulting fight always made things too costly for their enemies to be bothered with. Total defeat. It chafed at his scales that he had to consider that in the present, but there was nothing to be done about it. "Oh no," Harold said. "You're about to surrender to the humans when you get the news of Vorth Secondary." "What's happened with Vorth Secondary?" Sethrak asked, even more annoyed now. If this human had come to make vague threats, then he wasn't in the mood for it. If anything, this only made him more inclined to vaporize the human the moment he had the opportunity to do so. "Oh, I suppose I can go ahead and tell you," Harold said, that affable smile never leaving his face. "It's not like you're going to remember any of this anyway." "What are you—" "Vorth Secondary is about to be hit by the Genesis Death Star." The what?" Sethrak asked, trying to maintain his composure and not doing a very good job of it, honestly. "Is there going to be a problem with the star in that system that leads to its destruction?" "Oh no, not that," Harold said. "That's just the term they came up with for the weapon, for all that it's an awkward amalgamation of sci-fi speak, which can be troublesome to work out if you're not familiar with the human cultural darmoks that led to its creation." "Nothing you're saying makes sense, human," Sethrak said, even more annoyed now than he'd been previously. "It's a new weapon the Terran Federation is getting ready to use on you. Talking with the generals running things in this day and age, it seems they were rather looking forward to a fight where they would finally have the opportunity to demonstrate the power of the fully operational terraforming station. And you were the first contender stupid enough to declare war against humanity after they invented the thing." "What is a Genesis Death Star, then?" Sethrak said, wondering if this human had lost their mind. "It's quite simple," Harold said, grinning as he leaned forward and pulled up a video of Vorth Secondary. The first system his glorious ancestors had settled so long ago, for all that it was close enough that it was relatively easy for them to make it there, even within the lifespan of one of their people with sublight drives. He understood the humans had a bit farther to travel when they first took to the stars, which explained their damnable generation ships littering the cosmos. This was obviously Vorth Secondary, But then there was a flash at one end of the circular disk. A moment later, a blinding light enveloped the world, from the night side to the day side, and then in an instant all the lights on the night side winked out of existence, and there was nothing but a beautiful green pearl floating in the darkness of space. Of course, it's a little difficult to see what's happening on the ground level when you're looking at an orbital bombardment view like that, Harold said, pulling up a new video on his tablet with a swipe of his hands. But luckily there were cameras put in place on the surface in multiple locations, so they could get good information on exactly what the device would do. Wait, they've already done this terrible thing? Sethrak asked, his mouth going dry as he stared at what was happening on the screen now. The view was horrific, even by the standards of the atrocities he regularly ordered his forces to do, all in the name of making sure no one in the galaxy would ever dare to defy the glorious Empire. Though honestly, there were a lot of times when enemies were destroyed in the name of the glorious Empire, whether they surrendered when it was appropriate or not, so he wasn't sure how well that even worked as a deterrent. On the screen, the cameras showed entire cities being remade. It was the only word he could think to use to describe what was happening. They were torn down to their component parts in an instant, and then from there they were remade until he was staring at something that looked like a virgin world that hadn't been touched by civilization. Admittedly, they thought something, like a neutron bombing, might be more appropriate, but this remakes everything in an instant and provides a fresh colony world for people to exploit. I never thought the Death Star designation was appropriate, considering it leaves the planet's biosphere intact rather than destroying it, but then again calling it a Genesis device isn't appropriate either, considering it's not remaking the entire planet so much as it's reconstituting technological civilization on the world in question. Sethrak the Unvanquished stared in astonishment. Then he turned to the human, rage filling him. "And you're saying this test has already happened? Fourth secondary is already destroyed?" "Oh no, not yet," Harold said. "I suppose. That's spoilers as well, but the planet is still very much floating in the middle of the sky untouched. It'll be another hour or so." He glanced down at a chronometer on his wrist as he did so. Sethrak was aware some of the humans liked that sort of thing, for all that he was also aware there were many of them who operated using implants that allowed them to occupy a completely different reality most of the time. It seemed like this. Human was currently operating in a different reality, and it was a reality Sethrak wanted nothing to do with. "What are you—" He reached out and tapped a couple of buttons on his chair. He meant to bring up communications with the Vizier on Vorth Secondary, but the only thing that met him was static. He turned to the human, certain the creature was part of the reason why this was happening. "Explain the communication disruption," he snapped. "Communication disruption can mean only one thing. Invasion," the human said with a smile. "What are you talking about?" It was a little joke. Again, it's something I don't expect you to understand if you're not aware of sci-fi speak, and why would you be familiar with a Darmok that's a result of humans taking to the stars and making a bunch of references based on thousands of years of science fiction? It's actually a fun academic exercise to use a period-appropriate Darmok instead of one that's based on hundreds of thousands of years of science fiction, though the classics are always going to be the classics. He chuckled at that, but Sethrak didn't see the humor. "I don't know what any of this means," Sethrak growled. "Well, it was a double meaning. The actual reason you can't get in touch with your representative on Vorth Secondary is you're in a time stasis field, and so even if you were able to get a call through, it wouldn't work, because the stasis field has rendered you out of sync with space-time through the rest of the universe." That uneasy feeling developing along the back of Sethrak's skull was only getting more and more pronounced as everything the human was saying hit him. "And the bit about invasion?" he asked. "That's a line from a movie," Harold said, back to that same affable look he'd had when he first inexplicably showed up. "But there is a Terran invasion fleet that's going to drop out of warp space in a short little while and make sure you realize things are going to go the same. Here on Vorth Prime as they did on Secondary if you don't go through with an unconditional surrender sooner rather than later." Sethrak felt the beginnings of one hells of a headache pulsing through the back of his skull. His scales shuddered in irritation. Nothing this human said made any sense, even as a lot of it made sense if you looked at things from a certain point of view. The problem was he didn't like the point of view where anything this human was saying made any sort of sense. It implied things he really didn't want to think about, when he was on the eve of ordering his forces to commit to a retreat action that was going to result in a lot of his people dying. He didn't care about the people dying in his name, so much as he cared about the unrest that was undoubtedly going to cause once his subjects got wind of his plan. At least one emperor had been deposed that way, though that information was really locked down in the archives. I think I can make a couple of adjustments to the field so you can get a real-time look at what's happening on Vorth Secondary right now. But of course, I'm not going to let you send any communications to any of your forces on the world. Spoilers. Again with that word. Sethrak wanted to destroy this human who was hitting him with that insufferable look. Again, he had the overwhelming sense nothing he said was going to do anything to stop this human from, well, he'd rather not think about the implication of where this human was from. There we go, Harold said. You should be able to get a live view from Vorth Secondary now, but again, don't try anything funny. You won't like it if you tried anything funny. Sethrak stared at the irritating human for a long moment, and then decided he was going to go ahead and try it anyway. Certainly this one was irritating, but that didn't mean... He hit the button on his throne and was treated to a view from one of Secondary's moons. Everything looked normal. In fact, it looked disturbingly like what he'd seen in the recording the human showed him. There was something vaguely disquieting about the notion that everything looked exactly as the human had told him, for all that the humans were masters of deception, so good at telling stories to one another about all the things they were going to do in the universe that they'd invented millions of ways to trick thinking beings in the rest of the galaxy who didn't care for that sort of trickery. I see, he muttered. So it would seem Secondary is still there, but... He tried to hit a small button in the corner of his control display, and immediately the panel grew hot. He bit back a few choice curses as the thing exploded. Some of the shrapnel from the explosion landed against his leg, causing him to stand, and hop back and forth a couple of times, hissing in annoyance. That explains the mysterious injury, Harold muttered to himself, glancing at Sethrak and shaking his head. Damn closed time loops, but that's one lingering mystery from the records solved. To think all the hours I spent in grad school writing papers on why you were healthy in videos from earlier today and injured during the surrender, and I was the one who did it. What are you talking about? Sethrak hissed. I told you not to do that, Harold said, though again he said it in the tone of a being that didn't have a care in the world and didn't care that the Emperor had just tried his best to inform his people there of something that may or may not even be happening. He felt like an idiot trying to send that message even as there was a voice in the back of his mind screaming at him that he needed to find some way to tell someone what this strange human was sitting there telling him. You might want to grab a tablet, Harold said. I've lifted the time freeze for a moment. Why? Spoilers. Sethrak snatched a tablet from the table next to his throne. It glowed red for a moment, and as he stared at the damnable thing, he realized the reason it was glowing red wasn't because it was about to blow up in his face. No. The thing was broadcasting a warning to any and all forces in the vicinity that a human fleet had just dropped out of warp and entered orbit around Vorth Prime, which should have been impossible. Sethrak glanced to Harold as he saw that alert, and, We're back in stasis, Harold said. What are you? Sethrak asked. Harold smiled again. It was one of those unassuming smiles, thought this time there was also something else there. The Xeno experts said the humans bared their teeth as a way to show friendliness rather than that they were about to fling their feces at someone or try to rip their face off. But there was a distinctly predatory gleam to the way this small man was staring at Sethrak in that moment. Ah, yes, he said. I'm afraid I never properly introduced myself. I'm Harold, no need for last names, and I'm here on behalf of the Terran Federation's 50,000th year anniversary celebration. I'm afraid your empire is really nothing more than a minor footnote in the vast history of the Federation, of course, for all that Vorth cuisine is something that invaded the Federation in a way your militaries never could. Sethrak felt a queasy. He couldn't do the math off the top of his head, but the very idea that there was a 50,000th year celebration taking place for the Terran Federation that had only been on the galactic scene for less than a century as the humans reckoned it told him all his worst nightmares were coming true. This human sitting before him, unassuming and missing most of his hair, was more terrifying than anything the Terran Federation could throw at him. He licked his lips. And I am to assume this is... Harold pulled his stylus out once more and started jotting notes down on the tablet. I suppose you can consider this something of an exit interview as you prepare to leave your job as Emperor, Harold said. Again, Sethrak licked his lips. His teeth bared for a moment as he sensed a threat, but he didn't bother doing anything. No, this human had already made it clear there was nothing he could do. And what am I going to do when I'm no longer the Emperor? He asked, fearing the answer even as he had to know. Oh, you'll be moving into the exciting field of having your head stuck in a preservation field that keeps you alive and aware as you're stuck on a pike to serve as an example for all would-be Vorth tyrants for as long as the Federation exists, Harold said. I spoke with your head when I was a young teenager, first thinking of going into the field of Vorth history, though you didn't have much to say aside from incoherent screaming and mad babbling. Almost like there was a part of you that recognized, me and your madness, for all that the wipe shouldn't make that possible. But extreme prolonged trauma does weird things to memory wipes. I understand why you'd recognize me now, too. I see, Sethrak said. I suppose you can take some consolation, though, Harold said. Consolation? Well, yes. Every Vorth Emperor is terribly concerned with their reputation and whatnot, and you can rest assured you're going to be the most remembered Emperor in Vorth history. Even if it isn't quite as you'd hoped. Sort of like the guy we interviewed in the bunker under Old Central Europe for the Ancient History series. Sethrak turned and ran for the door. He wasn't surprised when he bounced back and away from the thing. Then he turned and threw himself at the human, but again he bounced off the man like it was nothing. He spent an interminable amount of time raging through his private chambers in an ultimately vain attempt to free himself. When he turned around, Harold was still sitting there. The man glanced at his watch and then up to Sethrak. Only a week of raging, he muttered. You truly are as impressive as I thought from my reading. I really wasn't lying when I said I was a big fan. In an academic sense, of course. You're also a bastard who's about to get everything that's coming to you. Sethrak finally moved back over to his private throne and fell down on the thing. It let out a great groan as he sat there, staring at this human who told him things that should be impossible, but he knew now there was no chance the strange man was lying. Harold leaned forward, smiling faintly. Now, please, keep in mind this is all very important and we need it for historical accuracy. Tell me how you're feeling in this moment as the Federation forces close in on you. Don't leave out any detail. Sethrak stared at the human. Then he sighed and launched into exactly how he felt, taking some pleasure in knowing that very little of it would be the sort of thing historians saw fit to print, future or otherwise. Enjoy next story. Krell sensed the shouting before it started. It was a ninth sense he'd developed since coming to the camp. Wake up, scum! A familiar voice shouted. Great. It was Seth handling the pleasantries this morning. All of, you up, there's work to be done. Karel was already shooting up. There was no sense in delaying. That only resulted in some poor bastard closer to the entrance got a kick straight to their favorite pieces of anatomy because they weren't getting up fast enough for Seth's pleasure. Karel winced, but didn't say anything. He didn't even outwardly react. They wanted them to react. They loved it when prisoners reacted. Reacting only brought the kind of attention he didn't want or need. I said, get up. Do you think this is a pleasure camp or something? Karel's fur rippled. He resisted the urge to groom himself. There was no point. His fur was so matted with dust from the mines that it didn't matter. All he'd do was give himself a dry tongue, and that would be foolish considering the water ration wasn't enough to survive on. The corpses lining the path down into the mines was proof enough of that. Seth pulled out his plasma blaster and pointed it at another worker scrambling to get his clothes on. Seth fired once, and they fell to the ground, a smoldering hole in their back. That was why Karel slept in his clothes. It's not like it was any dirtier considering their surroundings. Anyone else not ready to work? Seth shouted, moving his plasma pistol across the small room as though daring somebody to defy him. No one did. What was the point? That poor bastard with smoke smoldering from his fur was proof enough there was no fighting the perps. They lined up and shuffled out. Karel tried to ignore the smell coming up from that plasma hole in the stranger's backside. Not that it was difficult to ignore the smell. There were all sorts of unpleasant smells in the camp after all. What was one more? They shuffled out, into a bright day. Corell looked up at the sky and blinked a couple of times. It was a pleasing bright purple color, for all that the color had gained some unpleasant connotations in recent years. He wouldn't let them take that away. The color reminded him of when he'd been a young man, living on the farm with his parents and then his wife, and his fur started to ripple in sorrow, but he carefully schooled himself to stillness. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of knowing they were getting to him, though there was a part of him that knew there was more to it than that. It was less about giving them satisfaction and more about not attracting attention. "Line up for your meal," Seth shouted. "It's more than you bastards deserve, but we're feeling generous today." Corell lined up with everyone else. As he got in line, he was surprised to see Crazy Eddie already there. "Extraction coming, Eddie?" Corell muttered, low enough that he hoped the guards wouldn't overhear. Crazy Eddie looked at him, his face covered in the same dirt and grime as everyone else. Though it was more obvious with humans considering they only had the hair up top. Supposedly they also had hair in other places, but they were obsessive about keeping that covered. Even in the camp, Corell had never actually seen the human down in the mines, but that didn't mean anything special. The mines were a big place. This was a big operation spanning multiple work camps, so it's not like it was all that odd that he wouldn't see one human down there, even if the humans were noticeable. Crazy Eddie was one of only a handful of humans in the operation. Supposedly, they'd been captured shortly after the new planetary government started rounding up undesirables, which had seemed like madness to Corell at the time, though his standards for what qualified as madness had undergone several unpleasant revisions since. "Any time now," Crazy Eddie said, grinning at Corell as he briefly glanced to the sky. At least Corell was pretty sure that was a grin. Humans didn't wiggle their tail stumps to show amusement. No, they bared their teeth to the universe, a sign of aggression in most sapient species. But of course, a human trying to be your friend would be a mark of severe aggression with any other sapient species. The humans were funny like that. Corell marveled that one had even been captured and brought here, let alone the several who seemed to be in every camp he'd been to before winding up in this one where he was destined to die. He looked Eddie up and down. He was dressed in rags that might have been a military uniform once upon a time. Then, he looked over to the guards and marveled that they were able to capture a human. "Bastards," Eddie muttered. "You shouldn't talk like that," Corell said as they got closer to the food line. Crazy Eddie had taught him a smattering of human words, mostly the swear words. There was always a chance the guards wouldn't know what was being said about them, but best not to take the chance considering how trigger-happy they were. His fur sank as he saw what was on offer in the food line today. More of the same slop. The perps weren't interested in feeding them enough to live on. "We'll be lucky if there's even a small smattering of meat," Corell whispered. "Homeopathic." "Stew!" Crazy Eddie said, then laughed as though he'd just told the greatest joke in the world. That first word wasn't one Crazy Eddie had taught him, so Corell wasn't quite sure what it meant. He also didn't dare ask. None of the guards turned to look at Eddie as he chuckled. Why would they? It was well known among everyone at the camp that the human was certifiably insane, even by the standards of humanity, and that really said something. Or maybe it was fear. The human was supposedly totally under their control, but the guards had to know the stories. Corell had seen the way the guards' fur rippled in fear, the way their tail stubs quivered like their grandmother was telling them a scary story. Not that Corell figured any of those bastards had any reason to fear anything. They were the monsters from stories whispered in the night, after all. His own people turning on them, putting them in this constant torture, and all because they had slightly different markings on their fur. His own fur almost rippled in anger, but he brought it under control. They were bastards, but he didn't want to risk drawing their attention? Not even when he had the odd camouflage of the insane human standing right next to him. Nobody wanted to look at the human, and so they tended to ignore anything else standing near the human. "Watch out," Eddie whispered. Corell barely had time to react before the blast hit. He hit the ground and rolled in the dust. He looked up to see Eddie on top of him, grinning that slightly unhinged grin, as though he didn't realize he was trapped in a work camp that was meant to work everyone until they lost their utility for the war machine sweeping the planet, and then it would be off to the showers. That was a euphemism Crazy Eddie had taught him. Something disturbing from ancient humanity. He didn't have the crazed smile when he mentioned it either. The camp didn't have an equivalent to showers, but everybody knew what it meant when someone was put on a work detail in the deep mines. Same concept. Different execution. Carell might have laughed at the double meaning if he wasn't rolling on the ground with a loud ringing sound deafening the world around him. What the hell? Carell managed to mutter through the ringing in his 5 ear holes. Crazy? Eddie grinned. That was a genuine Terran curse. Good job, Carl. Carell shook his head at the human's strange pronunciation. Carl was the closest approximation the human's mouth could make. Crazy Eddie looked up and a frown hit his face. That more than anything had Carell worried. When a human frowned, especially an unhinged, smiling lunatic like Eddie, it meant things were bad. Stay frosty, Eddie said, patting Carell on the head in a familiar gesture that he now knew was something they did with the apex predators they kept as pets on their world. Only the humans would discover an apex predator that was a threat to their dominance and decide. It was cute and would be useful on their hunting expeditions, or to keep the damnable rodents from their planet that had since spread throughout the known galaxy. Much like humanity, Carell had fought some of those rodents for scraps of food on several occasions in the camp. Carell glanced around. His ear holes still rang, but he could see the telltale signs of something bad happening. People were pulling back into their shanties, their fur rippling in fear and their tail stumps quivering. As though the hovels made of stone and whatever scrap metal they could scrounge from the mining operation would be enough to save them from the guards. He looked to the towers all around the edge of the camp next. Some of those people with rippling, fur and quivering tail stumps were looking in that direction. Soldiers waited up there. Actual soldiers, and not the guards like Seth. Their plasma blasters were trained in on the camp and not towards any outside threat, as though his people could be a threat to them in their current state. Still, the soldiers stared at them as though they were a different species entirely, beneath them. Both feared and disdained at the same time. Those blank stares were unsettling. The way they could look at him like he was less than them, and all because they believed the propaganda of that. Carell pushed those thoughts out of his head. Politics was a luxury for people who weren't trapped in a death camp, after all. All he could do was hope to survive a little while longer. He looked over to the food table, though it had been blown to bits. The camp workers, others with similar markings to him who'd volunteered to work the food detail in the hopes of getting some extra scraps, were all lying on the ground. Some rolled around moaning piteously, but most were still. The plasma crackling across their fur told the tale of what had happened. He looked up and saw a glowing tip on one of the guard towers. They'd fired on the table, and still his stomach grumbled. He wanted to rush over to an overturned metal pot of stew leaking its precious contents on the ground, but he didn't dare. "You might be wondering why I destroyed your food this morning," a voice shouted. Carell turned to that voice. It was a purple stripe with ornate markings dyed into his fur around that stripe marking out his clan and position, the camp commandant. Carell moaned as piteously as the wretches in their death throes by the remains of the food table. He hadn't ever been present for a visit from the camp commandant, but he knew enough from those who'd survived past visits to know it couldn't mean anything good for them. "Did you know production is down at this facility?" the commandant asked, moving in quick and precise motions. Nobody answered. What was the point? If ever there had been a rhetorical question, Carell figured that was it. The commandant wasn't looking for an answer. He was looking for a scapegoat. And Carell wouldn't stick his claws out and risk volunteering himself. "Quite a problem," the commandant said, making a vague gesture with his own claws. Screams rang out from one of the shanties. A moment later, soldiers marched out pushing women and children ahead of them. The unfortunates were from a couple of different species, but mostly Carell's. After all, his planet had been an interstellar trading hub before the new regime took over and decided to institute their purges for the good of the purity of their race. The sons of bitches. Shit, Crazy Eddie muttered under his breath. "Extraction? Damn it, Eddie," Carell muttered. "Now isn't the time for your crazed ranting." It's clear to me that what we have here is a failure to properly motivate, the Commandant shouted. He paused, and his fur rippled. With pleasure. Which made Corell want to lose the contents of his stomachs. The only thing that kept him from losing those contents was that his stomachs were already empty. He'd be lucky to get up some digestive juice. He figured his body barely had enough liquid left to do even that. He looked at the dirty, emaciated forms moving towards the camp fence. Children and women crying because they knew what was about to happen. His lungs went out to them. It was terrible that children should know such terror, and all because their markings were a deep red rather than purple. But such was the nature of the world. It was the purple skies, the very nature of their world, that was one of the justifications the perps used to prop up their bloody regime. What I think we need is better motivation, the Commandant shouted. The soldiers pressed the captives up against the fence. It rattled and almost gave way. After all, it's not like the guards needed to put much effort into keeping them fenced in. Not when the rattling would be enough to alert soldiers who could capture them well before they got very far. Not that the guards or soldiers did much capturing of anyone who dared try and escape. I've spent a great deal of time trying to devise a way to motivate you Reds properly, he shouted, and the off-worlders as well. He looked to an emaciated Calvan with its tentacles drooping. The thing looked like it had been utterly destroyed spiritually. I've tried giving you extra rations that actually had meat, the Commandant continued. Still, you don't work hard enough. I've tried threatening you, but that doesn't seem to be enough. I'm now low on my quota, and that will reflect poorly on me with my superiors. If I'm reflected poorly to my superiors, then you suffer the consequences. He became slightly unhinged towards the end of that speech, spittle flying from his teeth as he flexed his claws. Almost like that bastard leader these assholes revered, so giving his speeches on the holodisplays when he was rising to power. There were times when Corell still didn't understand how a minority voting bloc who represented such a small segment of the population had risen to power. But it had happened, and now here he was years later. It had all seemed funny at first, then vaguely disquieting, and never once had anyone realized that each small step towards what the humans called hell was irreversible. That horrors didn't happen overnight, but one morning you could wake up and find that the nightmare was on your doorstep ready to round you up and take you away because you didn't speak up when you should have. Fuck, Eddie muttered. Extraction. We need extraction. Corell looked at the human and almost felt pity and annoyance. Clearly this was the human's way of dealing with their situation. His mind had broken, and all he could do was hope for an extraction that would never come. Maybe an extraction was what he'd been waiting for when he was captured, and his mind had fixated on that when it broke. So I'm going to try something new today, the Commandant said. He made a gesture, and the soldiers that had rousted those poor people from their hovel raised their plasma rifles. Screams of terror and rage filled the camp. A red stripe Corell didn't recognize broke from the terrified. Masses, the only movement in the entire camp, and ran four of the people against the fence. Corell wondered if they were his family, or if it was simply that he hadn't been broken yet. Corell felt shame that he wasn't running towards them as well. Shame that he'd take another few breaths of existence in this nightmare rather than the quick exit. That quick exit came, well, quickly. A soldier pivoted and fired their rifle, blasting the poor bastard who flew back and skidded on the dusty ground before coming to a stop. Corell shivered in terror. He was so terrified that he barely noticed the movement. A weight lifted from him. Eddie had gotten up. He shuffled towards the camp commandant in his crazed way, muttering the entire time about extraction and other things in his strange human language that Corell couldn't quite make out, for all that he'd befriended the human and learned some of their words. You see? The commandant said. I give you Red's food, guaranteed employment, and a place to live, and this is how you repay me? He moved a claw. A soldier by the fence raised their weapon and fired. One of the children screamed, then went silent. The silence didn't last long, though. A mother's wails filled that silence soon enough. Corell squeezed his eyes shut. He didn't want to watch. He wished his ears were still ringing loud enough that he couldn't hear. Anyone who closes their eyes gets shot, the commandant snapped. You will witness this. Carell opened his eyes, but he didn't look at the firing line, and he wasn't the only one noting that something different, something odd, was happening in the camp today. As Crazy Eddie moved towards the Commandant, who still hadn't taken note of the human, something changed. The human went from shuffling and limping to moving with more purpose. His stride became more confident. Confidence. There was something Carell hadn't seen in the camp in some time. At least not among the residents. "You will..." "What are you doing?" the Commandant shouted, finally realizing the human was moving towards him. His own eyes went wide as his fur rippled in surprise, and that surprise became more pronounced as Eddie went into motion. It was a sight to behold. Carell had heard stories of human fighting ability, of course, how they punched far above their weight, how they could change their muscle mass by lifting heavy things and do seemingly impossible feats with those frail, hairless monkey bodies. It was said they came from a world where everything had tried to kill them, where they'd been tempered in a constant struggle for survival until they'd come out on top and made the biosphere that had spent so many generations trying to kill them their bitch, as the humans like to say. Eddie did a quick twirl and landed a foot square in the Commandant's chest. The Commandant grunted, obviously surprised as he flew through the air and landed, skidding like the lone defender who'd just been killed for his trouble. Only Eddie wasn't done. He broke into a run, moving impossibly fast to close the distance to the Commandant. As though he wasn't as malnourished as everyone else in the camp, he landed on the Commandant and punched the clawed hand that came up to rake across his face. Then with a quick move, he grabbed the other arm and twisted. There was a sickening crunch, followed by the Commandant's howl of pain. Eddie made a chopping motion when the Commandant tried bringing his plasma pistol to bear with his other hand. The plasma pistol fell to the ground. In an instant, Eddie had it and was holding the bastard's plasma pistol up to his head. The soldiers hesitated, then trained their weapons on Eddie. Anyone fires, and your furry friend here gets his brains fried. I think you all know what happens when there's a plasma bolt rattling around inside your skull, right? Eddie's voice was clear. Commanding. It wasn't loud, but it rang out through the camp nonetheless. Carell could only stare in amazement. Eddie was a prisoner here as much as the rest of them, but he was also clearly the one in command, for the moment at least. There were still plasma rifle trained on him, plasma cannons from the guard towers up above, too. What do you hope to accomplish? Human? The Commandant asked. You're surrounded! I can sure as shit kill you before your buddies take me out, Eddie growled. Not to mention if they fire on me, they're hitting you too. The Commandant took stock of his situation. Seemed to realize Eddie's assessment of just how fucked he was. Another human word Carell had discovered had remarkable utility. The Commandant made a quick gesture with his non-broken arm, and the soldiers lowered their weapons. That's right, Eddie said, sounding strangely calm for all that he was surrounded. We're going to be nice and friendly here, aren't we? There's no need to bring weapons into this. What's your plan, human? The Commandant growled. You know you're surrounded. You might kill me, but you're still going to die, and all the rest of your companions are going to be killed as soon as word gets out. All you've done is sign your death warrant. Eddie licked his lips, and for a moment there was something of the craziness Carell remembered. It was almost a comfort to see that crazed look come back, though it also told him something unsettling. The Eddie who was commanding and in charge of things, and the Eddie who was half crazed. Well, they were the same person, two sides of the same coin, to use a phrase he'd learned from Eddie. It was unsettling, and in that moment he understood why so many species were wary of fucking with the humans. Such a useful word. Well, see now. That's where I figure you're wrong, Eddie said. Because I don't have to kill all of you at once. I just had to distract you for a little longer. Distract? The Commandant asked. What could you possibly... The Commandant's fur rippled in terror, and Carell turned to follow. His gaze. As he looked up, he saw something impossible. Machines bristling with armor and weapons, some streaked down through the atmosphere, others moving in low over the camp's fences that were flattened with the fury of their passage. His fur rippled with the fear of their coming. After all, Hadn't it been something similar that sent him into this living nightmare? Only those machines didn't look like anything his people used. No, they had a distinctly inelegant design, as though whoever had put them together was more interested in putting as much armor and weaponry on the things as possible, and considerations like beauty and aesthetics be damned. Though he figured there was a certain aesthetic beauty to the way they'd been loaded down with so much potential death. Potential death that opened fire all at once. Carell heard a strange sound, and it took him a moment to realize he was howling. A perfectly practiced dance of death surrounded him, and yet that death didn't touch him. Plasma blasts and beams lanced down from the ships, and everywhere they landed they hit a soldier or a guard. He watched Seth running, only to be cut in, half by a beam slicing into the ground, which was a swifter end than the bastard deserved. There was more, though. Soldiers in strange armor like something out of nightmares jumped out of those ships, hovering down with some sort of anti-gravity. Others didn't bother hovering. They slid down lines dropped from those ships. Where they landed, death followed, though not always. Some of those soldiers, for that's all they could be, were stunning and disabling rather than killing. They delivered death where a guard or soldier threatened them, to be sure, but they also seemed interested in taking captives, though the strangest transformation was in Eddie. Carell glanced over to see the human staring at the death and destruction with a smile of supreme satisfaction that never quite reached those crazed eyes. And as Eddie stood there, a transformation came over him. A literal transformation as well as the look in his eyes. New clothing and armor appeared in a wave rippling across his body. A moment later, he stood there in armor that matched the others. One of the armored humans, for that's all they could be, ran up to Eddie and saluted. Eddie returned the salute, releasing the commandant and shoving him at the soldiers gathering around him. The commandant looked terrified. He tried to get away, but there was no struggling against that fury, against that practiced death being, visited on these bastards who'd visited uncaring death on so many others. They can dish it out, but they can't take it, Carell said, repeating another favorite human phrase Eddie taught him. He was surprised to realize he'd spoken it aloud. For the first time in cycles, he didn't keep his voice low to avoid drawing the wrong sort of attention. Eddie looked around, and his eyes finally fell on Carell, huddling there unsure what to make of the fury all around him. Even as he knew, he was witnessing the fury humanity could visit on their enemies. Eddie walked over, looking surprisingly casual for someone moving through a battle, though even that battle seemed to be winding down now. It had all happened so fast. A whirlwind of death that hit, and now it was over. The human soldiers were moving surviving guards and soldiers into lines, their hands over their heads in surrender. But that wasn't all. They'd visited death and destruction with such practiced precision, but other armored humans that had a strange red cross on their uniforms moved through the wretches who'd involuntarily called this place home. And where they went, food appeared. Others tended to wounds. He goggled at the spectacle. So much death, and now they were giving life as well. What were these creatures? "Carl," Eddie said, grinning. "Looks like that extraction came." "You were crazy," Carell said. "Always talking to yourself. Because you were crazy." "Because I had a line back home, and I didn't want the bastards running this place to think anything was odd if they overheard me. No one pays attention to the crazy humans, right?" He grinned again, baring his teeth. Carell flinched away from the aggressive gesture, but then laughed right along with Eddie. Eddie held out his hand. "Major Eddie Shames, Terran Expeditionary Force. We heard you could use some help, and so here we are. I'm sorry we couldn't come sooner, but it does take some time to put something like this together." "Like this?" Carell asked, looking around. "The liberation of an entire planet," Eddie said casually, as though it was nothing. Carell could hear booms in the distance, and as he looked up, he saw more fire trailing through the skies. "We got started a little early here because I acted precipitously to save some of your people. I'll get chewed out for that, but I've been chewed out before." Carell stared in wonder. "Why?" Eddie's face went serious, and he tapped a patch on his shoulder. "We did some pretty bad things to ourselves, Carell," he said. One of my ancestors was there when he liberated some of my people, my ethnic group, sort of like the clan markings on your world, from people who wanted a final solution, just like the bastards on your planet. Once humanity got our shit together, we made this promise to ourselves and the galaxy. Corell stared at the patch, but he couldn't read Terran. He only had the small smattering of words Eddie taught him. "What does it mean?" he asked. Eddie's eyes and voice were ice. There was none of the craziness, none of the command, only the promise of swift death for anyone who defied him. Never again. Thanks for diving into this story with me. Don't miss out on the next one. Hit that subscribe button, give this video a big thumbs up, and drop a comment below with your thoughts. I'd love to hear what you think.